안녕하세요. 여러분의 한국어 선생님 고빌리입니다. I've been learning Korean now for over 20 years. I started by learning the alphabet and a few random words sometime in the spring of 2005. Actually, I barely learned the alphabet at first. One of my friends at college tried to teach me the alphabet, and I remember that I couldn't do it. So if you're learning the alphabet right now, I understand. It took me a few tries to really get it. But later I ended up buying a book. In fact, this book right here is my very first Korean book, and I learned most of the letters and some really basic grammar. And this book, while I don't recommend it because now it's really old, was the first real Korean resource that I had to start learning the language. So I still keep it on my bookshelf to kind of remind me where I started as an 18-year-old kid who was interested in learning languages and thought that Korean looked fun. And since 2005, I visited Korea more times than I can count. Actually, I did count for this video. I've flown to Korea, only counting the trip there, I've flown to Korea a total of 18 times in the past 20 years. And if you add up all of the time I've spent in Korea, it would be around 4 years, give or take a few months. Now, most of my friends I made from learning Korean, and I even got married in Korea where I had to give a short speech in Korean. And I'm sharing all of this with you just so that you know how much that learning Korean has affected my life in positive ways. So in this video today, I want to talk about a few things with you. I want to talk about my biggest struggles that I had learning Korean and also what things I discovered about Korean after studying it for 20 years. And finally, I want to share some advice for what I might have done differently if I could go back to when I started. So first, I want to talk about some of the difficulties I had learning Korean, because if you watch my videos, you'll know that I teach Korean, and it might be hard to imagine that someone like me would have problems with learning Korean, but I had a lot of problems starting out. First of all, the alphabet was kind of challenging because I didn't have anyone to tell me that I was saying things wrong. I wrote down English letters in my book to help me remember the Korean letters, and that didn't really work that well because some of the things that I wrote down were also wrong. So I was just basically remembering incorrect information. But I kind of blame that partially on my book because it was in 2005 and there weren't really that many resources yet. And anyway, but after I learned the alphabet, I started noticing that the words in Korean aren't always pronounced the same way as they're written. Now, you'll recognize this as sound change rules, but I didn't know this concept when I was starting. So I would learn a word and then I'd write it down and practice it, but then everyone would say it differently and it was just really confusing. So shout out to my free sound changes cheat sheet, which I really wish I had back then. I'll put a link to this in the video description box. Now, I wasn't a stranger to learning new languages. By that point, I had been learning French for 4 years in high school, and I was also self-studying Japanese for almost 3 years, which in the beginning of learning Korean, that was a huge help since the word order of Japanese and Korean are very similar. In fact, both Korean and Japanese share about 60% of their vocabulary through the Chinese language. This is kind of like how English and Spanish both share vocabulary through Latin. So that was really helpful in the beginning to be able to convert Japanese words right into Korean. It was like getting a bunch of vocabulary words for free. But the more Korean that I learned, the less that Japanese and Korean line up. So past the beginning levels, actually barely any Japanese grammar matches Korean. And when I started getting into things like Korean passive speech and more advanced grammar forms, that advantage I had from having studied some Japanese went away. And things started to get really difficult once I started learning about politeness levels. In Korean, the way that you speak to someone depends on many factors, mainly your relationship with that person and your age and their age and a few other things. For example, if you are having lunch with a friend and you wanted to tell them to try eating something that you ordered, you could say something like 먹어봐, try eating it. But if that friend is older than you, even by a year, you'd probably actually want to say 먹어봐요 to make it sound more polite. And if that person is someone you just met today for the first time, like if they're a friend of a friend who you don't really know that well yet, you might want to instead just say 드셔보세요. So you'd have to use different verbs and verb endings depending on how you speak to someone. You could refer to yourself as 나 when you're talking to your friend, but you'd refer to yourself as 저 when you're talking to a stranger. Now, fortunately, learning politeness levels just means you memorize some new words and a few new rules, and it's not that big of a deal. In fact, I made a completely free entire video course all about Korean politeness levels that I'll also link in the video description box if you're really interested in mastering the politeness levels. And it doesn't take very long to just learn all of these rules, but since I didn't have access to a course about politeness levels when I was first learning Korean, it did take a lot of time and practice before I was able to feel for myself which politeness level to use and when. And this is what took the most time for me, learning how to feel when I should use each grammar form and each vocabulary word and each politeness level. And this didn't happen overnight to be able to feel that. It took a lot of studying so that I could understand how it all worked, and then it took a lot of practicing so I could internalize everything. Okay, so those were the difficulties I faced while learning Korean, and now I want to share what I discovered after 20 years of studying. And the first thing that I discovered after studying Korean for 20 years is that you don't need to study Korean for 20 years to be fluent. Although you could look at me and think that it took me 20 years, so it'll take you 20 years. Well, you don't need to become a Korean teacher on YouTube in order to speak Korean fluently. Now, first I need to briefly define fluent. Everyone will have their own definition, and my definition is if you can talk about whatever topic you want, even if you speak a bit slowly, even if you make some mistakes, and if the other person can understand you without any difficulty, and you can understand them without any difficulty, then that makes you fluent. And the key part of my definition is without any difficulty. When I was a beginner and I had to keep stopping people and asking them what words they were saying or what words meant, or if they had to really focus in order to understand what I was saying, those times I wasn't fluent. So to me, being fluent is basically the same thing as being conversational, but doing it comfortably. And there are different levels of fluency. Someone might be fluent and they can also throw in lots of idiomatic expressions, or another person might have really smooth pronunciation and intonation, or another person might sound like they're a foreigner, but they're using lots and lots of advanced vocabulary and advanced grammar. And all of that just depends on the person and how they like to express themselves. In fact, since I was actually living in Korea for the entire year of 2006, I was able to practice speaking and listening and also studying vocabulary practically full time. And Koreans around me started telling me that I sounded fluent after about a year and a half or so. And my story isn't special. I know many others who studied Korean while living in Korea who became fluent in even less time. One person I know became relatively fluent in just over a year, but for many other people I know it took several years. And some people I knew in Korea purposely avoided using any Korean, and even after living in Korea for over a decade, still couldn't speak the language. So it really just depends on how much exposure and how much practice each person is able to get. Just because you're living in Korea doesn't mean you're going to end up speaking Korean. But also, on the other side, even if you're not living in Korea, you can still learn Korean. It's just related to how much practice and how much exposure you're getting. And everyone out there learning Korean is doing these things at a different rate. So just because someone you found online managed to speak Korean in 2 years, that doesn't mean it'll take you the same amount of time to learn what that person knows. In fact, it might happen even faster if you're getting more exposure to the language and more practice than they do. And also, Just because someone else learned Korean, that doesn't mean that they finished learning the language. Someone can be fluent when talking about everyday topics, but as soon as that person tries to write a professional business letter or discuss chemistry or politics with someone in detail or try to summarize Lord of the Rings, then it becomes a completely different story. So if you're someone who's really interested in a specific hobby, like if you're interested in sports, for example, you might end up learning a lot of sports vocabulary and sports expressions that someone else who's fluent has never even heard before if they have different hobbies. And I'm also still learning new Korean words every day, especially since I started to become interested in digital photography from a few years ago. So I'm learning words for things like aperture, exposure, and other words related to that. So there is no finish line when it comes to learning a language. I can always learn new things. So now I want to share what I think is the biggest difference between 20 years ago and now. Since I started in 2005, we had the internet, but there weren't any websites where you can learn Korean, at least not that I remember. There were a few books, like the one that I got, but no free lessons. YouTube really wasn't a thing yet. So if I wanted to practice Korean, I had to find an online chat room, and most of the time there was nobody online to practice with because of the time difference. Now, I don't mean to sound like your grandparents who had to walk uphill in the snow both ways to go to school, but nowadays, those of you learning Korean have it much easier because there are so many resources available. In fact, I even made a 100 episode video course that takes you from the very beginning of the alphabet all the way up to a basic conversational ability. And this course is completely free, as in 100% free for anyone to watch. And I'll also put a link to that course in the video description box. But when I was first learning Korean, if I had a question about something, I just had to go up to someone and ask them. And I'm not saying all of this to brag. I made so many mistakes I wouldn't have made if I were starting out today. Now you can just ask a language exchange friend or just Google it and get a dozen resources about any question. And back when I made a mistake, nobody would even tell me what I did because Koreans are just too dang polite. So don't be jealous of me for having started 20 years ago because I'm jealous of you for getting to start now. I mean, no, I don't want to go back and learn it again, but if I were 18 years old again, yeah, it would be easier to get started learning Korean than before. Okay, so finally, I want to give some advice to brand new learners that I actually thought about this as if I could go back 20 years ago, what would I tell myself? And this is what I'd say: make more Korean friends. Since I was living in Korea, I got to make a few friends, and a couple of them I actually still do keep in touch with. But most of the friends that I have right now, I've made in just the past decade. In fact, just in the past handful of years. And the reason is I didn't fully understand just how important Korean friends are to learning Korean. At the time, I thought that if I wanted to learn Korean, I just needed to study more, and that's it. But as anyone who's crammed for a test knows, as soon as the test is over, you just kind of forget everything unless you keep using what you're studying. It's difficult just to retain it. So having friends to practice with, or at least having someone, even if they're not a friend, just someone that you can practice with, will be the key to helping you improve more quickly. And I had a few friends, but I wish I had gone out of my way to make more because it's easier to make friends while you're in Korea than outside of it. And if I had more friends, it would have helped me to keep improving my Korean, even during the times that I wasn't able to travel there. But there's one more thing that I'd also tell myself if I could go back 20 years, and that's to watch more Korean media. And you might be thinking now, Billy, I do nothing but watch Korean media. Well, that's not what I mean. When I first started learning Korean, I wasn't interested in Korean movies or dramas, but I also avoided other types of media too, like variety shows and talk shows and even podcasts, which would have been super helpful to me for listening practice. I could have watched variety shows when I was bored or listened to podcasts while cleaning the house, but I did none of this. Of course, I do this now, but 20 years ago, the thought didn't even cross my mind. But now what I do isn't just watching Korean shows because that's not really very helpful. If you just turn on a show and read the English subtitles, you're not getting anything out of that program. And this is what I think most people do when they're consuming content in Korean. They're either reading the subtitles in their native language, or they turn it on and just leave it playing in the background while they focus on other things. But when you do this, your brain isn't switching itself into its Korean mode. And if you want to get more out of your media, then you should really be doing what's known as active listening. There are two types of listening practice that you can do: passive and active. Passive listening is the first kind that I described. So when you watch Squid Games but you read the English subtitles, that's passive. Or if you're listening to a new song but you're just focusing on the rhythm or just the dancing, that's also passive. Active listening, however, is the opposite. You're actually listening to the show. You might watch a variety show and there are only Korean subtitles on the screen, or maybe they have English subtitles but you're completely ignoring them. That's also active listening. Or if you're listening to a podcast, that's by default going to be active listening because there aren't any subtitles, there aren't any context clues to tell you what's going on, and if you don't pay attention to what they're saying, you're just gonna miss everything that they're saying. So doing active listening can be a big pain. I remember I'd get headaches after about an hour or so, but it does get better and you'll really speed up your learning if you're doing more active listening practice. And you might be wondering, well, what if I don't understand anything? Is that still helpful? Well, yeah, even if you don't understand, just actively listening to more material and continuing to practice with your language exchange friend and continuing to study will make a huge difference in the long run. So that's what I would tell myself if I could go back 20 years. Okay, and while I do have some more advice, I don't want this video to be too long, so I think that's enough for today. Thank you for 20 years. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and also subscribe to my channel for more Korean learning content. I also have a Patreon page if you'd like to help support my channel. All of my video courses, my Korean cheat sheets, and my live streams are provided here for free. And I run this channel through member support from people just like you. And I'll put a link to my Patreon page or how to join this channel as a member in the video description box below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again next time. 그럼 다음에 또 봐.